Peace and love, family. Welcome to another Read Book Club discussion. Tonight we are discussing chapter 2 of They Were Her Property by Dr. Stephanie Rogers. I am your co-host, Dr. Ma'at, and I have with me, you already know my co-host, Big Brother T, and I have the students of Marcia. She's actually here too. So it's not just the students of, but Sister Marcia Pender and her students are joining us for these book club discussions. So without further ado, I'm going to pass the mic to Brother T. Brother T, you got to unmute. There you go.
My bad. Hey, everyone. How's everyone doing? This is Brother T. Pleasure to see everyone this Sunday. Thank you so much, Dr. Ma'at, for having the platform for us to discuss. They were her property. You can catch me on YouTube as JT Coin Rings, where I turn everyday coins, silver and gold coins as well, to rings. And also every Sunday with Dr. Ma'at discussing the book of the book club.
Sister Marcia.
Hi, my name is Marcia Pender. I am the mother of 3 children, 2 that I homeschool right now in high school, and also help 2 other families homeschool their high schoolers as well in a very Black-centered, Afrocentric way. So we are excited to be discussing this book this month with you guys.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to put you out there. My name is Taryn Pender. I am Miss Marcia's daughter, and I am happy to be here, ready to discuss this chapter.
I'm Sabrina Review. I'm 15, and I am ready to start this chapter for this week.
Hi, I am William Pender, and I really enjoyed this chapter because it felt very easy to read for me.
Excellent, excellent. And I want to say what's up to the family in the building. I see Brother Gregory Terrence. He said, Hotep family, looking forward to the discussion on this chapter. I see Brother Steve is in the building. He said, greetings from St. Louis, Missouri. Peace and love to you. I see Sister Donette Mitchell. She said, good evening from Northern California. Ashe. I see the Queen Mother, a beautiful mind, is in the building. Peace to you, a beautiful mind. She says, hello, everyone. I see Crystal Denise, the number one librarian. Look, the number one African-centered librarian in the country is in the building. Peace to you, Sister Crystal Denise. She says, greetings, family. I see Letitia AM 100. She says, greetings, family. What up, Letitia? So, family, take a moment out right now to thumb up the video. If you haven't thumbed up the video, thumb up the video, thumb up the video. Also, family, share the video, share the video. Let's get the views up. Tonight, we are discussing chapter 2 of They Were Her Property. And in the title of chapter 2, it says, I belong to Demistis. I belong to Demistis, right? But I titled this, if you look on YouTube, or I don't know if you're watching on Facebook, it says Antebellum Southern households were not as patriarchal as you think, right? That's what I really got out of this chapter when I read it, is these households were not as patriarchal as we think. A lot of Europeans would have us to believe that their households, their communities are extremely patriarchal, right? And so a lot of times the Black community gets attacked because they look at our communities and say, oh, your community seems very, matriarchal because it was always grandma, big mama, and all of that, right? So our communities always get, we get criticized for having big mama and auntie and mama in them. They always making the plans, Brother T, and, doing all the arrangements, and we get criticized for that. But but then you read this book, and you realize, wait a minute, their mamas and aunties and grandmoms was running their families and their communities as well. They just have a patriarchal face. That's all they have, a patriarchal face. But really, when we tap into this chapter, when we get in this chapter, you'll see who was really running these households. All right. What up, Blockchain? I see Blockchain Revolution is in the building. I see Baba Kwame is also in the building. So, family, make sure you share this discussion. Even if you don't have the book and haven't read the chapter, still tune in, because I'm telling you, family, you're going to learn a great deal of information. So, Brother T, go ahead and kick it off, Brother T.
Yes, this chapter, we're on page 25. As Dr. Ma'at mentioned, I belong to the Mistis. when I was reading the first couple pages, the first thing I thought about was how the mistress learned how to get protection under the law. This chapter, first couple pages, was a progression of Sarah and Davis, who lost all her rights and her property. We got introduced to a term called coverture. It's a legal doctrine. And this legal doctrine forbade her from engaging in commercial endeavors or dealing with the enslaved ancestors. So we started off the page and we learned about the femme covert. As such, a very being, a legal existence, were no longer hers. They had been subsumed into a husband's property. So we start off with the first paragraph, and I kind of found a definition of femme covert. So this talked about Sarah Ann Davis, who was married to a widower named John C. Bethia in Marion County, South Carolina. She was 29 years old, and he was 20. He was 20 years her senior. Now, according to the legal doctrine of coverture, the change in Sarah Davis' marital status made her what they call a femme covert. As such, her very being and her legal existence were no longer hers. So anything she came into the marriage with was now turned over to her husband. And that is when the problem started. Because it didn't matter if the husband was a good steward of money, business, or any affairs. If he was a poor steward, guess what? His property and her property could have been taken, which it was. So this is why I named the start of this chapter, she was under, learn how to be under the law. And most of these mistress learn how to fight and separate their legal property from their husband's property, because we found out that and later in this chapter that it was their property was taken from debt that the husband owed if the husband didn't manage the plantation right. So women start to realize, I need to establish some legal rights under this coverture, get rid of this coverture, that we could keep the property that we had. So Sarah hands over all control of her slaves to her husband John Bethia. But Sarah, even though she gave the ownership or the control to her husband, she kind of treated her slaves different, as we learned in this page 26. Sarah treated her slaves with a certain care and was different from John. It wasn't no better because she still had control over them, but she made sure they ate different. They didn't work as much. So that's the only control she kind of had. She made sure that they didn't work as hard as John's slaves. She wanted to make sure her property, the enslaved ancestors, was in better care. And that's one only control that we've seen in the first couple of pages that Sarah basically had. Her slaves were better clothing, and she didn't work the young hard. But everything else that came along with slavery, her slaves pretty much did. That's how I wanted to start that off.
And I just want to interject right here, Brother T. And that was beautiful introduction to this chapter. You really see their beliefs, their religious beliefs, this whole idea of like the doctrine of coverture, right? Like when they described it, talking about being under the covering, of your husband, I immediately went back to my upbringing. My mother, I was raised Christian. And so I went back and I started, thinking about the things that I read in the Bible and the things that I read, in church, how, the man was the head of the household, the woman, the man is the head, the woman is the neck, right? You suffer a woman not to teach, or you suffer a woman to learn, but learn from a husband, right? Go to a husband and so the Bible is very patriarchal. How I talked about even becoming one. You saw I said as soon as a woman, got married, then she became, one with her husband. but it wasn't a Ma'at oneness, a Ma'adian oneness. It wasn't complementarity that we're taught, in traditional African culture. This was, well, no, what was mine now became yours. It wasn't like it was ours. It's like, now I got to hand over all of my rights to you, my rights, my assets, right? Is now you have total control over me. You get what I'm saying? And so it was very patriarchal, Brother T. And and I was thinking about that. I started thinking about my Christian upbringing, and how that's what we're taught. You know what I mean? That's the doctrine, especially when you read like the Old Testament. Lord, we won't go there. The Old Testament, that's what it talks about. And so when I heard that doctrine of coverture, I said, okay, this is connected to their religious beliefs. That's all it was. It was connected to their religious beliefs, Christianity, Catholicism. And so that's where they got that whole idea of being covered, and then your husband now owning all the stuff that you own, and now he assumes control over your assets. They said even control over your body. You know what I mean? Like, he controlled not only your assets, but he controlled your body. He controlled you. But anyway, Brother T, I love how you pointed out that women became savvy and said, oh, let me learn ways to circumvent this whole doctrine of coverture. And so does anyone else want to jump in and talk about ways in which women learn to circumvent the doctrine of coverture?
I think what I noticed was, before, I guess it was called prenuptial agreements. Essentially, that's what they invented. I know it wasn't called that, but I forgot exactly what they called it. But they just essentially made their arrangements pre-marriage, and made it a requirement that if we're to get married, because I can't vet you properly, let's sign these papers. I keep what I came in with. You keep what you came in with. I have total control over my assets. You do what you want to do. And if you get into debt, that it ain't got nothing to do with me. But I think they started becoming very savvy legally, with paperwork, down to how they had to even submit the paperwork, making sure that they noted it in like newspapers, and having people of reputable, I guess, like reputation that could be believed. Stuff like that is like the way to cover their bases. Was very smart. Go ahead. You got something?
To me, with this, like, what really stuck out to me, and what I kind of how you said earlier, like, if you gave this chapter a title, to me, if I had to title this chapter, I would tell it "She Was His Property," because in a sense, she kind of was when she got married, if she didn't know her legal rights and what she could and could not do. And but also further goes to the point that everything that they looked at was a business. Even just something as simple as marriage wasn't as simple as, like, getting marrying the right man and starting a family, and then you kind of do stuff together. It was, which woman am I going to pick who has the most assets and will do the most for me and my prosperity and pay any debts that I have.
Repeat that one more time. Repeat that one more
Sorry,
time.
I wasn't loud enough. Okay, so I said, if I had to title this chapter, I would title it "She Was His Property," because it wasn't just as simple as I fell in love with this woman and I'm going to settle down with her and start a nice family. It was, who can bring me the best assets to do what I need them to do, which would be either something that's paying their debt, or starting a nice plantation for me to make it a certain amount of prosperity to either give to my children or just for his own personal gain.
No, absolutely. Yeah, mute. Yeah, you got mute. But yeah, absolutely, Torin. I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. It was like they I was sitting here thinking, like, I wrote in the margins of my book, I said game. Like, people were still running game, just like people run game today. Hold on, brother T. You know how people just be running game today? Like, I'm just looking for a come up, like, let me get with her, or let me get with him. People say the fan, hypergamous. I'm just hypergamous, but I call it game, right? Like, you just looking for a come up, and people lied about who they were. Remember, they talked about different cases where women were saying that, a guy will come in from nowhere, right? Come into town and just present like he, in one case, she said the guy presented like he was this big time plantation owner, and come to find out he was like an overseer, on a plantation. So, but we had that, I remember my cousin, and Letitia, she's watching. She said to me, human behavior is consistent. You know how we want to believe in 2023 that the behaviors that we are seeing is new. Oh, this is new. They're just now, the guys are now just acting like this. The females are now, it's 2023, and look how they're acting. Then you start reading history and you say, well, they were doing this in the 60s. Then you go further back and say they were doing that in the 50s. Then you go further back and say they were doing that in the 1800s. Human behavior is consistent. You always had human beings trying to get married, presenting to be something that they're not, trying to come up, lying, scheming, and scamming. You always had it. That's why they have rules in place. People had code of ethics, code of conducts in every culture, because you always had something going on. That's why they have rules in place. Don't sleep with the wives. Don't sleep with your neighbor's wife. Don't lie. Don't cheat. Don't sleep with the same sex. They had all those type of rules because it was happening. That's why they had it. It was happening. Don't steal. Don't cheat. Don't do this, because it was happening. Human behavior is consistent. So, Brother T, when I was reading this stuff, like, yeah, he came in town, swindled the women out of their money and their assets. You know what I'm saying? I said, oh, they was running game back then. No different than we run game today. You got brothers, that are step to sisters and present they always say you meet the person's representative or whatever, but presenting to be something that the person ain't, and vice versa. You got the sisters that are put on the whole costume and she'll present like she's something she ain't. And then when you get it and you marry it, you say, oh man, this wasn't what I signed up for. You know what I mean? So this stuff has always been going on. Brother T, go ahead. I know you wanted to jump in.
That was the point you made, Dr. Ma'at, is what I wanted to talk about, which is on page 29. On my notes, I put that men started out catfishing and becoming imposters of wealth to bait well-to-do, individually wealthy women. So it reminded me of the Tinder swindler and everybody else who was playing games. So this is, like you said, been going on for a long time. And by the time they found out, they was already taken. And like the example that you stated that was on page 29 is about the man who was up north and he had the overseer position. She didn't find out till late. This man had no money, and by that time, they was already married. One thing that that was pointed out: a lot of women, even though they were still married, it was I think bed and board is what they call the law. They still stayed married to their husbands, even though they took them to court to fight for ownership and full control of their property. So they was like, hey, I just want to have what's mine and keep what's mine, and but I'm staying married. It was only a few cases that was shown that they divorced. So they just wanted to make sure they had ownership, and I'm sure out of those laws, prenuptial, as what was mentioned earlier, that it probably came out of this because the man was still responsible to take care of everything, even though she controlled her property. One thing that was not explained in the chapter, maybe if I missed it, someone could bring the point up, that if money was made or wealth was created from her property, did she keep that property or was it the family's property? Because it only seemed to say if the man acquired debt is when things were taken. So I want to know if it was just her continuing to pass on through what they call a life estate, or was it something that the wealth from both properties, were the families and not just hers. I want to know if she came in with it and did she leave out with it. Did anyone see that inside the chapter?
Okay. No, I didn't. Yeah, Brother T, that's a really good question. Like, I would love if Dr. Rogers was on the panel and she could answer that, because you got that's a great question, because she didn't stay. So right. I didn't come across, whether she came in or whether it was, that's a really good question, Brother T. Go ahead.
Another thing that she mentioned, if I can go a little further on page 29, was the court examinations where were put into place to protect women's inheritance, and also male intimidation. So male intimidation continued of the land signatures and have separate estates were also measures to ensure protection of property. So even when women were going to courts and saying, hey, this is my property or it's not my property, I'm giving all the rights to my husband, the courts tried to put into place to make sure that there was no intimidation. Because the man was like, you better tell them that this property belonged to me. So they had to put things in place even to continue to offer protection for the mistress, because men were going in and saying that she's lying. This property does belong to me. So they also had to put things in place, like I said, to make sure that male intimidation wasn't there. So they, from the start, even on page 28, women exercise their rights in courts to regain their ownership, and it's documented that they've been doing it for a long time. But also, every time they put a law in place, men found a way to take it back away. Say, and that's where the intimidation came into. So as the chapter goes on, the law and the protection for the women strengthened. And as we said before, Dr. Ma'at, we were taught that white women had no rights. And we showed that the court cases prove that they was building rights. Now, we know in America, taxes, rights go to landowners and business owners. They got all the rights. Well, this woman was considered a business owner, property owner as well, with an inheritance. She had the same rights and privileges that the rich white man had. And that's what she was trying to gain more of a stronghold of.
Facts. And I just want to acknowledge one of my favorite artists in the building. I see Sincere Love to God is in the building. Family, make sure that you go and stream his new album called The Master's Table, which honors all of our ancestors, Dr. Amos Wilson, Dr. Francis Cress Wilson, Shahrazad Ali, Dr. Claude Anderson. Like, his whole album is dedicated to the master teachers. And so shout out to Sincere Love to God. Love and honor to you, King. I just wanted to acknowledge him. But yeah. So let's go back, Brother T. So you on page 28, 29. I hear what you're saying. Let's flip it over to page 30, where it talked about slave. It says some slave owners consulted with family members about their preference before writing their will. So there were a lot of different strategies that these women use. So like you named it earlier, Brother T, you said the courts. They went to the courts. So when creditors would come after their assets due to their husband's debts, they went to the courts. As a matter of fact, in the book, she called it it's called the Chancery Court. That's what it is. It was called the Chancery Court, which actually stemmed from Britain, but it was the Chancery Court where these women would go. And Brother T, nine times out of 10, they sided with the woman, because she came in there with bill of sales, deed of gifts, and even paperwork, contracts, marital contracts, and all sorts of stuff to substantiate, no, this is what I own and this is what he owns. Some of these women even had what they called, and I know Marcia mentioned it earlier, separate estates. So they went into these marriages saying, like she said, prenuptials. Look, this is what I own, and they call it separate estate. So this is what I own, and this is what he owned, because these creditors were going after these women by any means necessary. And remember, it said towards the end of the chapter that the creditors thought that, it was bogus that these women had these assets. They thought it was just a cover up, that these women, that these assets were under the control of these women, right? They thought that it was just kind of like, a bogus thing happening. Like, oh, you just really want to shelter and protect these assets. They thought it was really the husband's assets, but these women walked in the court and said, no, my father, this is his will. And this is what he specified in his will, or this was a gift when I got married, or when I turned 13, or, I got a gift. And so these women came in there with receipts to say, hey, these are my enslaved persons. And they came in there with receipts. They also had trustees. They appointed trustees to look over their estates. And so the trustees would help them manage. And like you said, and she mentioned in this chapter that sometimes the trustee was the husband, but if he couldn't handle his business and he mismanaged some stuff, She got him out of there. Okay. So these white women weren't playing. They utilized the law, they utilized the courts, they documented it. So even though they were illiterate, because it even talked about that, how some of them couldn't even sign their names on stuff. They had to use a mark. Even though they were illiterate, these white women knew how to work the system. They knew how to work the system. Let me ask you all a question. How did you all feel when you started looking at those newspaper clippings? So remember when a woman, when she would take her husband to court, and say, okay, he's trying to take my enslaved persons from me, and he's, he owe me $1,500 or $2,500. Remember, they had to, by law, air this stuff out in the newspaper. I started thinking about social media. You know how we think everything is hush hush, like, oh man, today everybody put all their business on social media. It's just terrible. Brother T, they was doing the same thing back then. You could open up the newspaper, Brother T, like this. Brother T, you go open up the newspaper, you say, oh man, Susan Johnson and William Johnson, man, she took him to court yesterday, and he owes her $1,500. They had it all in the newspaper, because remember, that was a stipulation that once you took your husband to court and a judgment was made, you had to submit that in writing to a newspaper. So people were looking at the newspaper back then, Brother T, looking at who owed what. So that was like the 1800s. That was social media for them. Today we look at the cell phones, right? Taryn and Will, we look at the cell phone and say, oh my goodness, what they doing on social media? Oh, so-and-so died. So-and-so had a birthday. Oh, they went to the prom. Oh, they went on vacation. So we look at all that. They use the newspaper, honey. The newspaper, Marcia. You looking over there like, oh my gosh, Joshua had a judgment against him. Oh my goodness, Suzanne divorced Tony Anthony for Sue. Oh my. So all of their stuff, their indiscretions were in newspapers. So did anyone want to talk about that? Like when you saw those news clippings, those newspaper articles, and even the we saw the receipts when you had some people who argued that white women really didn't own enslaved people, but then there were actual articles in newspapers that Miss Susan, she was looking for Anne, and Anne must have ran away, or she believed that Anne was stolen from her husband, and she put it in the paper. So how did you all feel about looking at those newspaper clippings?
Okay, go ahead, William.
I found it to be very interesting on how the newspaper clippings were somewhat like a telling of what was going on in the court, with who was being sued or why they're being sued and stuff. And it felt very interesting to see how currently it's pretty similar to how they had it in the newspaper, where there's social media and people are releasing videotapes and recordings and live streams of an actual court thing going on, versus getting a newspaper about basically the same thing.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. Did anyone want to add? I see Brother T.
Yeah, the protection and of the article inside the newspaper was also for creditors, um, because you had to prove that ownership was now the wife's. That kind of took all confusion out, or any naysaying or any doubt that they think that it was just a transfer of wealth. They had to let them know that in this paper, based off the article, the time, it's like a timestamp, that this is now the owner. So they had to do it. And even when it came down to Dr. Ma'at and panel, when she had to prove it in other cases, you had to put it in like 3 times. You had to put it in English and in French. They put restrictions to make sure that it was tied in. So putting it in the newspaper has really been their stamp. And I think even like, even today, I don't hear it as much. I know when we do obituaries and stuff, people say put it in the paper. It used to be in the Baltimore Sun, for those who are from Baltimore. It was a public record. And that public record was not just for family, friends, and the community. It was also for debtors. So it's been something that's been going on and the print media for a while.
Yeah, I personally found it interesting because something like that they don't normally put up as often anymore, especially with the limited amounts of resources that they had back then to put things like this out. I found it interesting that they put the trials, I guess, against the husbands and how they had the husbands used, but then they did them wrong basically, and they took them to court. I found that very interesting that they put it in the newspaper for everyone to see and to know that this happened.
No, absolutely. And brother T made a good point. Yeah, yeah. So you say you found it interesting that they put it in, but they, I guess, back then, I mean, that's the way they communicated. Like you get, understand what I'm saying? Like that was mass communication back then. So that
You
Yeah, that
creditors
was
would
like the
know.
only way to communicate.
Absolutely. Yep.
think
That
about it today, Dr. Ma'at. When people say it's public records, you can check it up. You can check it. Right now, we have online capabilities, and now that the law is that if it's online, it's legal. So people now can Google it. You know what I'm saying? It's worldwide. It's not just for your state. So a person in Idaho can check a Baltimore record that they have the case number, the person, thing. So it's public record. So I think it's something that kind of taken from that in 18th centuries that we still kind of utilize today. We just don't see it because, like, think about it: when property taxes, water taxes, if a house is transferred, all that stuff is public record. All you got to do is key it in. So this is a continuance of that type of document.
no, absolutely. No, absolutely. And shout out to, I see our brother Frank Owusu is in the building. He said, hello, everyone watching live from Ghana in West Africa. Peace and love to you. Madase Pi, brother, for watching. For watching. And brother, you got to call me, man. We trying to get out there with conscious ingenuity in May. And so he and I, we're trying to get the logistics down, family. So we'll be out there doing some STEM stuff with brother Frank. He's an educator at a school in Accra, and he wants to bring some of the programs that I have there. And so shout out and salute to my brother Frank Owusu. Peace and love to you. I wanted to say this. Oh, did you have something, William, you wanted to add?
I had a question, but it could wait before you say what you need to say.
No, go ahead, because I was going to move on to something else. Go ahead, brother Will.
Well, I was going to ask everybody, when they say that white women had to give up their property to the person that they're marrying, why do you think that they have to give it away? Like, do you think there's a specific reason why they don't want white women to have their property, or do you think there's a deeper meaning?
I think that was just probably their white male ego mates, like got to give it over because you can't have more than me, or somehow that makes him feel less than. I'm that. Yeah, I think that really was more infighting kind of thing, of somebody feeling less powerful.
As Dr. Mahat said earlier as well, I think it was also based and stemmed on religion, patriarchal, man being the steward of the household, taking care of all the finances, and I think that that's how it should have been based off that law. But in reality, realizing that men didn't know how to handle 200 slaves, land, and business, and that biblical sense they tried to imply wasn't something that really worked. You know what I'm saying? So as we seen, it was a lot of failings. So I think that it was only put there based off of law, and they took it off of a maybe the Christian belief. That's what I think, William.
Yeah, and I just plus one that, brother T. Like that's I just plus one. I think it was the religious beliefs, and they were their religion is extremely patriarchal, and so a woman, not only did she have to give up her assets and her body, she had to give up her name. Where do you think that custom comes from? When you marry a man and you have to take on his surname, you got to give up your surname. It also talked about how some women had to give up their own religion, when they married a certain, a brother, a man that had a different religion than them. See, William, you about to have me pull out some of my stuff, man. I'm trying not to pull out old presentation with a chart. I'm over there thinking about Civilization of Barbarism by Sheikh Anti-Jope, where he compares, how it was in Africa. So, and how it was in Europe. And he talked about that. He was saying, yeah, women had to give up. You had to give up your surname in Africa. In some ethnicities that we give up our surname. Yeah, we did. But then there were instances where the man gave up his, but we never talk about that though. We don't have those conversations where if he came to my clan, he had to assume our last name. We never talk about that. But anyway, William, good question, man. I wanted to talk about how our ancestors also used the court system. So it wasn't just white women using the court system. Our ancestors used the court system. So at the top of page 38, there was a case, right, of a wrongfully enslaved African woman named Winnie, right? Winnie. So does anybody want to talk about that? How she used the court system to gain her freedom? Because she's supposed to be set free after her slave master died. And, and then the slave master who died, I think it was her son or a nephew or something like that, kind of it gave her away to somebody else, and so still kept her in captivity. And Winnie was like, hell no, I'm gonna sue. And she said, I'm gonna take them to court and sue for my freedom. And she did, and she actually won. But let me tell you why I think she won. I think she won because she actually had the support of the son, who was saying, yeah, technically, yeah, she was supposed to be. I think that if he would have fought it, I don't think that she would have won, but I want somebody else to kind of build on it. The top of page 38. I'm gonna pass the mic. Top of page 38. Let's talk about Winnie. And she's not the only person that's done it. Dred Scott did it, right? So our ancestors also utilized the court system, you know what I mean, to their benefit. But it seems like they were only successful when they had the support of the white folks.
That's what I was just going to say. The Dred Scott came up immediately for me as soon as I read the story, because I was like, I think the only difference between these two stories is the fact that he just didn't have a white ally, as they would call it, somebody to vouch for the validity of what he was saying. Had he had that, he probably would have won his case. But in this woman's case, I mean, she actually had someone to be honest enough to say, yeah, I remember that conversation. It was an oral thing. And so it was something that somebody would have to be in agreement to say, yes, I heard that. That's what happened. If he had not, I do not believe in any way she would have won that case at all. They weren't taking her word for nothing.
They were saying that a contract was on this page, on page 38, that the contract is on this second paragraph. If anybody, basically, I'm gonna read from it. It says that Winnie had also learned that the contract included provision that stipulated she was to receive her freedom upon Elizabeth's death. She knew that Elizabeth and her husband had not filed the contract with the court, but had given it to Reverend William Stout for safekeeping. So Winnie petitioned the court for her freedom and challenged her deceased owner's heirs, who were claiming her as a slave. So was it? So I didn't remember this part of the page. Was the contract brought to court and challenged, or was it also her son who claimed witness, Elizabeth's son who claimed witness that she would have her freedom?
I don't think he brought I don't remember him bringing
He didn't.
contract. Yeah.
Okay. I believe that there was a contract made when they got married, and the contract got lost. So this was all about who was there, who remembered. That young man said he remembered there's being something there, and then the Reverend Stout wrote a letter confirming the existence of a contract. So it was like his word also saying, yeah, I remember they did do a contract, and he told the court that he cannot and he will not gainsay Winnie's right to her freedom. And he asked that justice be done, and Winnie won her freedom. So between the Reverend and the son vouching that it existed, even though they don't have it, that's how she
okay.
Mm-hmm.
Got you. Awesome. Because that was one thing I didn't understand. I see that it was given to Reverend Stout, and I wondered if Reverend Stout also insisted and said, yes, I did receive it, but I guess he did help based off. Okay, gotcha. And that is a difference between the Dred Scott, because Dred Scott didn't have the representation. I believe Dred Scott was coming from the North, coming back to the South, and said, "I want to have the freedom of my family." I believe that's how that went, right? And it didn't. He couldn't do so, and that's when it was written that no black man could sue a white man in court, or any law. It could not be restricted. This is what the Dred Scott was kind of known for that saying that I know that still rings true. People believe.
No, absolutely. Can you all do me a favor while I move on to this next point I wanted to make? There was a statement. I can't find the page right now where Stephanie Rogers emphasized how white women's freedom was tied to our enslavement. It's somewhere in this chapter. But before we, while you all are looking for that, I do want to say this. For the life of me, I cannot understand why you have, after reading this chapter, right, and looking at all of these cases, okay, why you have fools running around on the internet saying that slavery never happened, okay? It never happened. It was all made up. And here it is. We're looking at actual court cases. The census, look at this, the 1830 US Census, where they actually list people and the number of enslaved Africans that they owned. And then now there's this movement. I don't know if the panel's aware of this. There's a movement on the internet that's taking flight of people saying, slavery never happened. People like Nat Turner never existed. Harriet Tubman, she never existed. None of these people ever existed. Slavery never happened. We were always here. The whole thing was made up. We're the slave ships. You all can't prove anything. And here it is. We're reading about people. These are actual people. These white women, Susan and these are people who actually existed and have court docs, okay, records that talk about what happened or what transpired between them and their husbands, or them and creditors. Or you have, like you said, Winnie, peace be upon her soul, who sued for her freedom, went to court and challenged her status based off of a contract. Like, these are real people. So when I read this stuff, I get so perplexed. Family, please, if y'all hear the foolishness on the internet, give them the Read Book Club link. Just give them the link and tell them to join us on Sundays so that they can learn. We got even the daggone students who under 21, Sister Marcia, who could, you get what I'm saying, who could easily refute that information. Like, it's really sad that, that we're here in 2023, just saying that these people didn't exist. This stuff never happened. And Dr. Rogers, wrote an entire book about white women, owning our ancestors. You know what I mean? And she has receipts after receipts after receipts. Family, I got to tell you all, backstage, I even shared with the panel. I said, man, this chapter was just too long for me, because she presented so many receipts to drive home, a few points. There's a few points she made in this chapter, but she presented a lot of receipts. And so we have the receipts, family. This did happen. This is not just some fictitious accounts that she's reciting. This stuff actually happened. Anyone find that line that I was talking about where she talked about, no, everybody's like, no. Okay, I'll let's continue. I'll look for it. But I'm on page 44, where they moved it into, not 44. Before we go to 44, y'all, I want to go to the paragraph on page 43, the middle paragraph, where it says, between and within the lines of formulae legal jargon, the legal petitions brought by married women repeatedly informed jurists that coverture, remember we talked about that, was not working. Not only were many husbands not covering their wives under their wings in the ways that Blackstone indicated, they were robbing their wives, squandering their assets, and violating their property rights. Wait a minute. This is what white men were doing. They always try to dog out black men. Man, they just be running up your credit. You don't want to get with a black man. He tear your credit up. He'll do this. Let's see what they were doing. It says Not only were many husbands not covering their wives, wait a minute. I'm thinking about the slave movies where the master was in the big house and all the mistress had to do was sit outside and look pretty, right? While the enslaved Africans were served, fanning them, Brother T, right? Fanning them. She just had to sit with her feet up. She got fanned, Brother T. They were bringing her some iced tea. Remember? They were doing her hair and stuff and watching the children. She just had to kick her feet up while the master was out there with his pipe, and checking in with his overseer and making money. No. It says not only were many husbands, and we're talking about white husbands, not covering their wives under their wings in the ways that Blackstone indicated, they were robbing their wives, squandering their assets, and violating their property rights. Worse still, many of these men had come to their marriage impoverished. Hold on. See, the divestors need to read this, Brother T. They be looking for zaddies. The divestors need to be in this book club. They be looking for zaddies, right? Said they were robbing these women, squandering their assets, violating their property rights. It says, worse still, many of these men had come to their marriages impoverished and proved to be irresponsible and incapable of exercising the rights which coverture afforded them. Finally, their inaptitude paved the way for their creditors to further breach which should have been inviolable boundaries that protected their wives' separate property from seizure. Married women throughout the South called upon judges to step between them and their husbands, protect the property that they claimed as their own, and prevent others from interfering with their enjoyment. With their enjoyment of the same. And when women's legal affairs were in proper order and their cases were strong, judges routinely heeded their calls. I got to shout out Dr. Amos Wilson, who brought this book to my attention. The Way We Never Were. The Way We Never Were. Dr. Amos Wilson talked about this book in many of his lectures. In the table of contents, it says The Way We Wish We Were, Defining the Family Crisis, the Leave It to Beaver and Ozzie Harriet American Families in the 1950s, My Mother Was a Saint, Individualism, Gender Myths, and the Problem of Love, the myth that we always stood on our own 2 feet, self-reliance in the American family. So in this book, they're destroying the misconceptions that we have about white families in this book. So we sit here as Black folks and we look at white folks and we think, oh man, their families are much more organized and structured than ours. They don't got all that dysfunction. The women are feminine and submissive. The men are, they're patriarchal. They taking care of the women. They're covering the women. And why aren't we? They were never like that. They wasn't even getting married. If you go back and look at the census data from back in the day, I think only 20 or 30% of white households were even ran by married people. They weren't even our marriage rate beat them up until like the 1960s and 1970s. We were thriving with like 80% marriage rate while theirs were at like 20 or 30%. So we sit here and we put these people up on a pedestal and they never deserve to be there, ever. But I think that we're just so brainwashed by like imagery and what we see on TV. But it's a stark contrast when you actually read history. Sister Marcia, did you want to jump in?
Yeah. I kind of wanted to jump in. I remember talking to during my field camp, we talked kind of about the brainwashing that white people kind of have on the young Black mind, even with the simple words such as that people use as Black terror, Black trauma. And she poses the question, well, why is it called Black trauma and not white terrorism? And I felt like that was really deep and pertinent to what we're talking about now. It's not that we have this baggage and this trauma that we're bringing with us. They terrorize and have conditioned our minds to think a certain way, and that we're not at a certain level where we are. That's the point.
Very good point.
The point I wanted to make was I remembered how much my great grandmother used to tell me about the she called it the white myth. She was like, what you think white people are, they just aren't. She was like, I grew up, she said, I got married and raised my children during the Great Depression. And she said, Black marriage was almost at its height during the Great Depression, where you had a lot of white families, and she cleaned for a lot of white families. Their husbands, some of them committed suicide, some of them left the home completely and like literally never came back. She said Black men, not that maybe some of that didn't happen on a smaller scale, but she was like, for the most part, Black people already knew how to struggle. So like the Great Depression wasn't new. It was something else to adapt with, but we knew how to make a way out of no way. So there was no need for the Black man really to leave the Black family in the way that white men did at that time. There was a lot of separation of family during the Great Depression era. And I just remembered that standing out to me as to why are we striving for this, what my grandmother used to call the white myth, whenever we had it together until we allowed them into our families, you know, by inviting them in. But yeah, that was it.
No, I love that you brought up this. So your grandmother called it the white myth. And like you said, we striving for a standard that they haven't even achieved. Like, you get what I'm saying? Like, we literally striving to be like that. And like Dr. Amos Wilson said, family, get this book, The Way We Never Were. They were never like that. Oh, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And then you start reading about how the government created a white middle class. Remember, Brother T, when we read in The Color of Law, the white folks was making $2,500 a year. Wasn't it a year at one point? But they were moving out to the suburbs. Because of what? The government helped them do that, created the suburbs and helped them get all these loans and stuff like that, and moved it out there and created a white middle class. But prior to that, they weren't pulling themselves. Everything they got, it was given. It was given. Look at all the land grants, the Homestead Act alone. It was given that. And then turn around and tell us, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. So they were never the way we think that they were. And so anyway, I just wanted to point that out. I'm moving on. Did anybody else want to move on? Here it is, y'all. I found it. It's at the bottom of page 45. It said these legal connections undergirded there, talking about white women, right? Because remember, they were connected to judges, right? They were connected to judges. They had contracts and everything drawn up to maintain their assets, okay, or control and ownership of their assets. It says these legal connections undergirded, also strengthened, their economic relationships to the institution of slavery. Moreover, their legal title to enslaved people empowered white women within their households. That's what I was looking for. It's at the bottom of page 45. Hold on, y'all. I'm putting a star next to it. These legal connections undergirded their economic relationships to the institution of slavery. Moreover, their legal title to enslave people, it empowered white women within their households. So our enslavement, chattel slavery, actually empowered white women. And so that's why I'm just perplexed when the sisters, you know, they run out to join any type of movement that these white women got going on, because it's never been about women in general. It's about them. It's about empowering them. It's not about us. They just use us for the numbers, Brother T. It's never about us. Never about us. They use us for the numbers. And a lot of us will fall forward and run in. And then we out there with signs. And once they get what they want, then they're out the door. You know what I mean? So it was always about empowering that specific group of women, not about empowering us per se. You see what I'm saying? You don't see white women, even today, right? Do you ever see white women, and do you have a few that attend the rallies when a black child is killed by the police? Yeah, you do have some whites that come out, you do, right? But you don't see those white women rallying in huge numbers to support Samantha Rice, the mother of Tamar Rice. You don't see them come out in droves. I'm talking about white women. You did not see them come out in droves to comfort those black mothers who they were batting for the police. right? Oh no, they were supporting the police, they were donating to the police and all kinds of stuff. So them white women are not concerned with empowering black women, or they're concerned with empowering themselves as a group. Brother T, did you want to jump in? Brother T, you got to unmute.
Yeah, the point I was trying to make, and I'm glad you was hitting nail right on the head, Dr. Ma'at. It amazes me now learning this in this chapter, exactly how they always fought for their rights. All they need was the vehicle that you discussed, the numbers. Now they can hide behind all of the social issues that's deemed to be important for our black women, and use it as a cartel. It's at the back end, right? So they continue to fight for these rights that benefit them, to strengthen their hold to the power structure and politics, and in every city and every state. It's amazing how, like, my eyes were open when I first said it. These women had rights. They had judges on their side. These women received property. It wasn't a dowry. It wasn't something that was given to them like that. They was, I mean, by their husbands. It was something that they were inherited. So learning this, it kind of opened my eyes that these women can be very crafty, very cunning, and we have to be aware that their practices stemmed from the early 1800s until today. Let's not think that they are the weaker group in their makeup. So these points are strong, and like I said, we need to make sure more people know about these readings, the history, the court cases, the filings inside of the newspaper, so we can understand how they look at power and how they hold on to power and property.
Now, absolutely, Brother T. I mean, I couldn't agree. I couldn't agree with you more. I couldn't agree with you more. At the top of page 46, she does say, Dr. Rogers says that the majority of these white women, they own maybe one or two enslaved persons. Like, that wasn't the average. Like, we don't want to think, all white women had hundreds of, no, it wasn't that. It said that, the average may have been, one or two, sometimes 10, sometimes 20, So I did want to say that. I'm trying to think, is there anything else on 46 and 47?
But some also came, if it wasn't numbers, when it came down to enslaved ancestors, they had land. At one account, I believe one mistress had 580 acres.
Yes.
So even if it wasn't slaves, right, they still was inherited. They inherited land. And it says in page 47, husbands were not always pleased when their wives possessed separate property or decided to manage themselves. So it didn't matter if it was two or three. What mattered was that it could not be included in the earning potential or paying off debts.
Yes. Say that one more time, Brother T.
It said it didn't matter if it was two or three slaves. If it was 2 or 25, the problem was, could they be included if a debt needed to be paid? And husbands wanted full control of everything that the wife had, not just the land, but also the workers.
Facts, Brother T. I'm looking at Van Varner said. I'm going through the comments because I try to keep up with the conversation, but also manage the comments. So Van Varner said, so white men were the original Dusties, but let these divestors and swirlers tell it. Lack of assets are solely a black man scenario. Facts. Come on, Van Varner. Don't get me started. Don't get me started. Don't get me started. But thank you, Brother T. Thank you for that. So I'm trying to think, is there anything on 48 or 49 you all want to highlight? Anything on 48, page 48 and 49 you want to highlight? Anything on, everybody's like, no? All right, let's move to page 50. And I think we talked about this when we said that, sometimes, the women appointed trustees to help them manage their estate. And sometimes the husband could serve as the trustee, But the white woman, when he was mismanaging it, she got him out of there. So, I mean, we talked about that. The only thing that I do want to highlight is in the middle of page 50, where it says Elizabeth Duncan had no qualms. She said about bringing her concerns to the court. Says petitions like her offer a strong challenge to the view that Southern households were monolithically patriarchal. I have a star next to that, and I'm going to underline this. Again, this is just kind of reiterating what we said earlier, how we were under the perception, right? Under the perception that, oh, all of the Southern households were extremely patriarchal. The woman sat home. She was resting in her femininity, as the divestors say. We don't even get to nest and rest in our femininity. We got to go out here and do this. No, boo. These women were doing it. They weren't resting or nesting in their femininity. They was getting robbed. They was getting taken off by their assets. These women were running to the courts. And it said that these judges served as like, patriarchal guardians or de facto patriarchs, for these women. You know what I mean? Like, oh, your man messed up, so I'm the judge. I'm going to come in and serve as a de facto patriarch, for your family. So white zaddy was ripping these women off too. It wasn't what you think it is. Okay. I mean, that's why it's important to study history, so we won't be operating with these misconceptions, right? And and saying these things out of our mouths. So they were getting ripped off. And so she says right here, Southern households were not monolithically patriarchal. So the brothers, yeah, y'all just need to sit down, and let grandpa run the family, because that's what's wrong with the black community. These women be running it. No, bro. It ain't that. It ain't that.
Or that stereotype. I was gonna say, or that stereotype where you see those black men who really are into white women, and they'd be like, "Well, if the black woman was just more submissive, like the white women." I'm like, they ain't submissive. What you talking about? Like,
they're not submissive at all.
Not at all.
These white women were taking their tails to court. These white women was putting their business in the newspaper, and like you said, them dudes, the what they call themselves, the passport bros. Yeah, I'm leaving the country because I want to go find me a woman that's submissive, and I'm out of here. The black woman too masculine. The white women are submissive. And then you reading this stuff like, man, you see what Suzanne did to Anthony? She talked about that in the book, how a lot of those men, how it fractured their egos. A lot of these men, it said one man actually challenged the judge to a duel and killed them, So these women were those men were embarrassed. They embarrassed those men, man, put their business on, but Karen's still doing that today. I don't even, they still do that to the guys today. They still marry them. She never stopped. Karen is the same yesterday, today, and forevermore. And so she still does it. Put them on Front Street, and so, that's if she don't off them. But that's a whole nother discussion. So anyway, let me see. 52. Is there anything else on 52 and 53? We already talked about white women being illiterate and not being able to sign. Anything on 52 or 53? Everybody's like, okay, go ahead.
I think that what I did find interesting was all the infighting, because, women seem to have needed some type of trustee or someone to help them with their, just like managing. And sometimes they would get their brothers. Sometimes, the courts would say, well, you could use your husband. But you saw that mothers would fight sons, aunts would fight nephews. It's like, nobody was really safe in this. Everybody's trying to protect their own stuff. People trying to take property that didn't belong to them and claiming that it was theirs. And then you got to prove who the slave belongs to. It was ridiculous. These people were some infighting, savage people. Like, it was ridiculous.
Yeah, and I'm glad that I'm sorry. I'm glad that you brought up that point, the infighting. You are 100% correct. But the way the families are depicted, you would think it was extremely harmonious. People were happy. Everybody's depicted as, happy and everyone knew their role and knew their place. But like you said, these folks were, like you called it, savage, man. They were taking people's stuff. They were going to court. People were getting sued. It's not as harmonious as you think it was. All right, Sabria, go ahead. You have the floor.
I wanted to mention a while back, I think around page 32-ish, they mentioned how they were fighting over what goes in whose will when they're married and they have kids. And sometimes they would give either the son or the daughter more, especially if the mother was a former slave owner. She would try to give both the son and the daughter an equal amount of land and or slaves. They would try to equal make it equal for both of them, but sometimes when the husband was only a slave owner, the wife would just give the son the land instead of making it even. I found that interesting personally.
I think that was because of the tender swindler, because the men were out there taking what belonged to the daughters. So the fathers wanted to limit giving any help or anything that could be taken easily. So that was one thing that was going. They call it a living estate. They would put that in their wills, and they also let it be known the who, what, and who was getting receiving what. So that was all about a form of parents protecting their daughters. I think if I'm not mistaken, that I read that in that part of that page too. So I'm glad you brought that up.
Absolutely. I think that was a wonderful, 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 experience. This is a lot of, I love what the synergy on this panel. I really do love it and appreciate it. On page 54, that's there we'll be talking about the de facto patriarchs or judicial patriarchy. They mentioned that. And Brother T, the point that you made earlier, where it says is it important to underscore that the majority of the women who filed lawsuits did not leave their husbands. They were not requesting separations from bed and board. That is what we would consider a legal separation today or divorce. Of the 208 cases, you talked about this earlier, Brother T, of the 208 cases for separation of property that appear in the Westlaw Campus Research Database for the period between 1800 and 1865, for example, only 28 of the women also requested separation from bed and board. So I'm like, dang, Brother T. So you took the man through all of that. You took the man through all of that and put the man on, got a judgment against them, put it in the newspaper for all to see. They didn't leave. It's just they just had to deal with it. It was just out there. You know what I mean? Like it was just out there. So that was the point you were making earlier. And then at the top of page 55, she says petitioning women did not always win their suits. A fair share of them did, but they did not always win their suits. And there were about three reasons why. So it says the donor of property used vague or non conventional legal language. Two, the lawyers did not include a detailed list in the contract of all the property that was being conveyed. And three, they entrusted one or more steps in the legal process, such as filing and recording the marital contract in the county to a husband or trustee, and then learned that it hadn't been done. So it says sometimes women won despite these problems. Other times, procedural flaws caused judges to rule against them. And so, could someone read this last paragraph, which really at the bottom of page 55? Because it really kind of summarized the chapter. This last paragraph, could someone read that?
The part that starts with the testimonies?
Yes.
Okay.
The testimonies of formerly enslaved people
You
concerning
sound, Terrain, you sound real low.
I'll speak up a little more.
There you go. There you go.
The testimonies of formerly enslaved people concerning their married female owners and these women's relationships with their husbands, supported by runaway advertisements.
Terrain, hold on. Look, Brother T going like this. Can you switch with your mom real quick?
Yeah.
Your
Okay.
mother sounds really clear.
Yeah, you can do it, Mama.
Oh, I'll just read it, she said.
Okay.
The testimonies of formerly enslaved people concerning their married female owners and these women's relationships with their husbands, supported by runaway advertisements, jailers notices, government and municipal documents, and propertied women's legal petitions, show that the doctrine of coverture did not operate in a monolithic way in antebellum Southern households. Many slave-owning women continued to view their property as theirs alone. even after they married. They did not resign themselves to every aspect of their changed legal status. They did not accept the legal assumption of their identities into their husbands. They did not mourn the loss of their property, and they did not accept the civil death Elizabeth Cady Stanton described in the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments, issued at the 1848 Women's Rights Convocation in Seneca Falls, New York. Slave-owning women understood how their positions would change once they married, and they frequently rejected the legal and economic ramifications of marriage by devising instruments that protected their personal investments in chattel slavery. With documents in hand that legitimated their legal titles to enslaved people, and with the court's acknowledgement of their ownership, women boldly articulated how they wanted their human property to be managed in their homes and communities.
Wow. That hold on.
Yeah, that's control.
That is control. These women, I'm trying to tell you, man, they was bosses, man. Talking about they was resting in their femininity. These guys crazy. They are crazy. All right, and so it ends with her just, just defining for us, what it means. What does ownership really mean? At the top of page 56. Brother T, you want to close us out with giving us those definitions?
That definition ring deep, and I kind of highlight everything. So just bear with me. It says scholars of jurisprudence define ownership as a bundle of rights that an individual has to a thing. According to A.M. Hornery, I think how you pronounce that, the bundle includes the right to possess, the right to use, the right to secure one's property, the right to manage, which involves the right to decide how and by whom the thing owned shall be used, the right to the income of a thing, which includes the fruits, rents, and profits, the right to alienate a thing during the life or on death by way of sale, mortgage, gift, or mode, and the liberty to consume, waste, or destroy the whole or part of it. If someone infringed upon any of these rights, the owner could be called upon the battery and remedies to order to obtain, keep of necessity, get back the thing owned. The honoree was not referencing slavery in this essay, or he was. He did not mention, but when applied to slavery, the definition describes the position of the 19th century Southern slave owner, an owner near absolute right to discipline, maim, and even kill the enslaved people he or she owned, and the power to delegate management and discipline to others were the cornerstone of the institution. Slave owning women exercise all the rights, including the bundle, including the right to do what one formerly enslaved man referred to her own bossing. So the ownership that the mistress had, she had all rights and privileges to do whatever she wanted to. And as the chapter ended, and it leads into the next chapter that we'll tackle next week. She was the boss, and they will be speaking on how the missus, done her own bossing because she had complete control based off the courts, based off the documents, based off the articles we saw in the papers. She was having control of what she deemed hers, not what we was taught.
Up here running I was running my mouth. I said she was, like you said, Brother T, she was bossing. She wasn't resting in her femininity with her feet up. She was bossing. And I can't wait next week to unpack, what that really meant, right? That she did her own bossing. What did that really mean? I actually think in this chapter she did her own bossing. But, in this next chapter, we're going to get into the nitty gritty of what it meant that these white women were doing their own bossing. And I think that was from maintaining their assets to disciplining, the enslaved persons, to running their system the way they wanted to run their system. They were making profits from the cotton and from the tobacco and from the rice, and managing their finances and doing what they wanted to do with their profits. I think all of that was a part of bossing. But we'll find it out, family, when we return next week to discuss chapter 3 of They Were Her Property by Dr. Stephanie Rogers, family. So make sure that you tune in at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time next week. Make sure you tune in, family, and also thumb up the video. The moderators told you thumb up the video. The more you engage the video on YouTube, the more it circulates, right? Also share this discussion if you're on Facebook. Post a link if you're on Twitter. Tweet the link. Okay, let's get this information out to the people. We already know that the internet is flooded, with a lot of misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. And we want to get some real information out to our people. Family, thank you so much for tuning in. I'll see you next week, next Sunday. Peace and Black power. Peace.